Australia's fake quantitative tightening program. Martin North, John Adams, and Interest People. Hi, John.
Hello, sir.
Back in the studio once again, and we're going to talk about the RBA and QT and whether it's real or not.
Yes. What I'll say, Martin, is that I think next week is quite significant. So the RBA board is meeting on Tuesday, and a lot of people across the country are going to be quite nervous about what the RBA does. We've been warning on the show for many, many years about the dangers of debt. And during the pandemic, a lot of people didn't listen to our warnings and they dived right in, and with FOMO and everything else. And a lot of people signed mega mortgages of high 6-figure, 7-figure mortgages. And while we had a 0.25% increase in official interest rates in May, the consensus, according to the Financial Review this morning, was that it will be 0.4%. Taking the cash rate to 0.75, and that will be quite surprising. Just in the last couple of weeks when I've mentioned the prospect of a 0.4% increase, people have been quite alarmed by that level of increase, although we do have some voices out there calling for 0.65 and 0.85 next week. So obviously interest rates are going up, and people should, if you do have a mortgage, particularly if you're on variable interest, you should brace for additional costs beyond all the other cost of living pressures and then the inflation that's happening across the economy. But then once we get into particularly next year, there's a very big, interesting sort of cliff which the RBA has presented last week, which is about quantitative tightening. And that's what we're going to talk about today, and whether this program that the RBA has rolled out is realistic, is it fake, is it a fantasy? Because if they do what they say they're going to do, it is going to be good night for many families across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just worth, I think, making 2 points about the official cash rate. That is not directly correlated necessarily to mortgage rates. In fact, a number of banks this week have put their fixed rate mortgages up quite a lot. In some cases, 0.8% already. So there's a big gap now between the variable interest rate mortgage and the fixed rates over 3 or 4 or 5 years. And the other point to make is that in New Zealand a couple of weeks ago, they put the cash rate up 0.5%. They're now at 2%. So the concept of moving it up by more than 0.25% is something we probably should embrace. And of course, there's talk in the US, the Fed is going to do the same when they meet in a week or so's time. So we are in an interesting position with rates going up, mortgage rates going up. And what I find when I talk to people is a lot of people are only just beginning to wake up to what this really means. And just to remind everybody, a 1% rise in the mortgage rate for a typical mortgage is a 15% increase in the monthly repayments on a principal interest mortgage. So these have a very significant upward impact on household budgets and households. And of course, at the time when costs of living are rising, inflation's raging, the power and the gas and everything is there too. So all of those factors have come together.
Yes, there's probably 2 points I'll add to that, Martin. Is the first one, and on this issue of quantitative tightening, I've just published an article on my website, and perhaps we'll put that on the screen for people to have a look at, and feel free to read the article after the show. But as I was doing the work this week researching the article, I probably didn't fully appreciate that before last month, as in May, because we're now recording in June, the last time that rates went up in this country was November 2010. And so there's a whole generation of new borrowers, new homeowners who have never experienced rising rates, but then obviously more experienced and seasoned house owners or property owners, is perhaps a distant memory of what is it like when rates go up. So that I think is a very interesting phenomena. The psychology of people who are used to low rates for too long, and one of the things we were just saying off camera is unfortunately there's too many people who got duped by economists who don't know what they're talking about. Now, people like to take shots at me and says that I'm, a lunatic, I'm a nutcase. I don't really understand what I'm talking about when I talk about economics. And no doubt you've had plenty of critics yourself. But two key points on this is we've had the RBA governor last November saying right throughout 2021, rates will only start to rise in 2024. And he said it as late as November. And while I think this guy's incompetent and he shouldn't be in the job, a lot of people, a lot of normal mums and dads, as well as the mainstream media, give the governor too much credibility. And people made financial decisions based on the expectations he attempted to set. And now people's household budgets are going to be blown to smithereens because, again, he's not a politician; he's a bureaucrat. And it wasn't a so-called political promise, but he would say, "Well, that's the best information we had at that point in time, and now that the evidence has changed, we're changing our position based on the new evidence." Even though in 2020 you and I were basically warning the alarm bells of stagflation, rising inflation rates, too much money printing, and what that will mean over the medium term. So that's point one. But point two is some of these so-called respected private market economists, and I'll call out two. One's Stephen Koukoulous, the Kook, and the other one is Peter Tulip. Now, Peter Tulip is a former RBA official who's now at the Centre for Independent Studies, and even the AFR went to town on them today and said that in 2020, both of these gentlemen were two of the biggest doves, calling for dramatic reductions in interest rates, even though I basically said it was a catastrophic economic mistake. And now these two are basically criticising the RBA for leaving rates too low for too long, and now they're saying you need to be super aggressive in terms of trying to catch up with all the other central banks. So, and what I think these gentlemen don't understand is, one, they misjudged their analysis in 2020, and now in 2022 they have no real concept of what does it mean for the average mum and dad family when they start to say we need to raise rates by like in the case of Koukoulous, he wants basically almost a 2% rate rise in about 3 months. And what that means, so you were just talking about a 1% mortgage rate rise. Well, if you get 2% in 3 months, what is that going to do for 30% increase in repayments? A lot of families are doing it tough right now. And one of the things that I just want to highlight, we'll put this up on the screen, is talking to people in small business owners in the last couple of days. The ATO gave a lot of small businesses a lot of leeway in terms of meeting their tax obligations and tax debts. Well, now the ATO has taken the gloves off, and now they're going around chasing people for money. And so you have tough economic conditions. It's hard to get staff. You've got increases in wages, or increase in input costs. You've got consumer confidence down. You've got the ATO chasing debt. And on top of that, now you've got surging interest rate rises by economists who don't know what they're really talking about. And a lot of small businesses, and this was a surprise to me, and I didn't fully appreciate this, that a lot of small businesses that have secured the businesses through a mortgage by basically borrowing against the house, they took additional equity during the pandemic to keep the business going. So there were some people who took additional equity to splash on luxury, but a lot of small business did it to keep the business going, and now they're going to be, the business is struggling in many respects in this economy. And then at the same time, you've got raising rates. It's for a lot of small businesses. I mean, obviously there's articles in the last couple of weeks suggesting that the insolvency industry, it was very quiet during the pandemic. Now it's going to be buzzing, and a lot of people are going to be forced to close their businesses and potentially foreclose on their houses because of these major mistakes in monetary policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see it in my surveys already, a lot of businesses saying 2 to 3 months is about it before they might have to fold. The other point I'd make, John, is that the data that came out today on the new credit flows from the ABS was down quite a lot, quite starkly down, actually. And the other thing that we should bear in mind is we're going to start seeing a credit crunch now, because essentially your ability to borrow is being reduced because the interest rates are already going up.
Yes.
The loan to income and debt to income ratios by some lenders are being reduced. And what that means is that basically people won't be able to get as much now as they could 1 or 2 months ago. So we're already starting to see as well as the pressure on incomes, people's inability to grab mortgages that they could have got 2 or 3 months ago. The slowing of credit is something else to bear in mind here, because that's going to be really very strong as rates go higher.
Yes. We will do a show soon about what I call this interest rate cliff. So, I mean, you make a very good point, Martin, in that there is a difference between variable rates and fixed rates. Now, back in late 2021, fixed rates were actually in some regards lower than variable rates. So a lot of people locked in fixed rates, sometimes 12 months, 24 months, or 36 months. So as they get off these fixed rates, and then they go either onto a new fixed rate or a variable rate, they're going to see a considerable jump. So for a lot of borrowers who borrowed this year in 2022, they've gone on to variable rates because they made more financial sense. But there is a interest rate cliff on those people who took fixed rates. And it's going to be a very interesting question as to when do those households who've either fixed all of their mortgage or who took a split loan, when will the music start to sort of really impact them and their households? And there's a different story to be told there.
Absolutely, and it's very important to understand that people had a mixture of fixed and variable and different time frames. So it's not like it all turns to custard on the same day, but the trajectory over the next 2 or 3 years is going to be up.
Indeed. Now, the conversation we just had, Martin, is all about the cash rate, which is effectively the short-term interest rate, like perhaps like a 90-day bill rate. Now, what we need to also consider is that beyond cutting official interest rates, the RBA did other things in order to provide more cheap funding for the banks, but also try to push long-term interest rates down. And so just to recap, what did the RBA do over 2020, 2021? Well, they lowered the official cash rate from 1.5%, which was at the start of 2019, all the way down to 0.1%. They reduced the interest rates paid on reserves held by the RBA on behalf of the commercial banks to zero. They offered cheap funding at 0.1. Initially, it was 0.25%, then 0.1%, which is called the Term Funding Facility. So, for those who don't understand what this TFF mean is, basically, the banks would go and borrow from the wholesale international credit market at a particular interest rate. So the RBA just printed money out of nothing and gave it to the banks and said, well, we're just going to give you a super cheap loan for 3 years. And that's going to drive your cost of capital down. And that will allow you to provide more cheap mortgages across the country. And that came out to the tune of $188 billion in terms of these loans. And we'll get into when they have to repay that, because I was a little bit surprised. And we sent some emails to the RBA to get some clarification about when those repayments are going to start. The other thing they did was buy a whole host of federal government bonds and as well as state government bonds, but they did them for 3 reasons. The first one is from March to May of 2020, there was a lot of volatility in the bond market, and there was a lot of concerns as to was the bond market going to continue to function in an orderly fashion, or was there going to be a liquidity event where someone was going to go belly up? So the initial buying of bonds was to provide liquidity to the market and to keep it stable. So that's what they call market function. Then they moved on to yield curve control, which was that they targeted initially the April 2023 bond, and then later on they moved on to the April 2024 bond, and they fixed the interest or the bond yield or the interest rate on that particular bond. Now, why did they pick that? Was because whereas in the US context, the 10-year bond is the typical benchmark which the entire market uses as a reference rate. In Australia, they use the 3-year bond, and that's why they targeted that. And so, again, initially they targeted at 0.25%, and then when they moved on to the 2024 bond, they took it down to 0.1%. So that was their yield curve control. And then they moved on to quantitative easing, which was they weren't targeting a particular price or a particular interest rate on the bond, but they just were starting to buying bonds right across the spectrum, from short-term bonds through to 10, 15-year bonds. And they basically spent on that north of, so they spent 223 billion on federal government bonds and 57 billion on state government bonds. So they printed exorbitant sums of money. So we're talking maybe $500 billion in total, and they pumped this into the market on top of lowering official interest rates. And again, what was the mantra in 2020 by Scott Morrison? This was providing assistance to the ordinary Australian being affected by COVID-19 and the lockdown. That is the fantasy that a lot of Australians believe, but that is not the reality. The reality of this package was to keep the banks alive, because had we gone into lockdown in 2020 with no support and people couldn't pay the mortgages and the economy came to a standstill, the banks in this country would have gone, and the Harry Dent deflationary scenario would have kicked in, and basically property prices would have fell 80%, and the banks would have went bust like in 1892. So this was all about keeping the bubble going, keeping the banks alive. And if anyone says to you this was all about supporting the Australian people, it's a complete myth.
Totally, absolutely right. And of course, the really interesting point here is that buying of bonds essentially allowed the governments, both state and federal, to essentially issue bonds at very low rates. So it actually cheapened government debt and reduced the amount of interest that they had to pay on the debt.
And not only that, it encouraged politicians to spend a lot more compared to what they would have spent had they had to pay market interest rates on in terms of government borrowing.
Absolutely. But of course now, if rates are starting to go up, suddenly funding costs start to go up, and then it creates this massive overhang. And the really interesting observation, John, is that comparing the amount that we throw in, we being the RBA and the government, and other international contexts, we did the biggest relative to GDP.
Well, yeah, so we did the biggest, compared to our peers, but we did the biggest in Australian history.
Yes.
And now you've got the deputy governor of the RBA saying we never expected an inflation problem. And funny enough, so we're going to get into this soon. There was a speech last week by Dr. Chris Kent, who's an assistant governor at the RBA, to talk about the commencement of quantitative tightening. And one of the extraordinary sentences in the report was that he suggested that they did a market survey at the end of last year, and everyone so supposedly the market economists expected inflation to remain low throughout 2022. So I mean that just shows you how poor the forecasting is across the market. So now,
well, they didn't ask us.
no, thing is, like they absolutely didn't come here and basically say to us. I would have said to them last year that forget about the ABS's CPI. I mean, you can just look at property prices and you can tell that there is a huge inflation problem occurring in terms of real time. Now, so beyond the raising of rates, what the RBA announced last month was the commencement of quantitative tightening. So all of this money that they have pushed out into the market, they now want to reverse it. And why? Because they want to basically try to get the RBA into some normality in terms of where it was before the pandemic, so that it can show that it actually has a manageable and responsible balance sheet. Because
you just mentioned that the balance sheet has absolutely exploded, hasn't it?
Precisely. So now what the RBA has suggested is that they're going to do two things. Now, if we can put slide 2 on the screen, Martin. So this is a graph from Dr. Kent's speech, and this is the quantitative tightening program. So it consists of two components. One is all these government bonds that they bought through market function, yield curve control, and QE. They're going to allow these to mature, and they're not going to buy them back. So what that means is that basically once the bond matures, the Treasury will basically give the money, the principal back to the RBA, and then the Treasury will have to reissue the next series of bonds into the private secondary market, and that will increase the supply of bonds, and with more bonds, that pushes the interest rates up. So that's what happens on the bonds. In relation to the term funding facility, what the RBA is requiring is that of the $188 billion that they lent, They want 85 billion paid in 2023, and they want the remaining to be paid in 2024. So what that means is basically all this cheap, super cheap money of 0.1%, the banks have to give that back to the RBA, and then they have to go substitute that capital by going to borrow from the capital markets. And obviously in an environment where rates are going up, and supposedly it's going to continue to go up next year, the increase in funding costs for the banks could be, easily a couple of percent, and that for the banks is a big deal.
Yeah, and of course the other thing they can do is to try and get more deposits. So you'll see that the deposit rates on term deposits have started to go up. That's the banks trying to actually pull some of that funding back in, because there's a lot of deposit money out there as well. But the funding pressures on the banks over the next year or two are going to be pretty extreme. The margins are already being compressed. And with higher funding internationally as well as in Australia, it's going to be very interesting to watch.
Yes. So when we start to think of, okay, so we have rising rates in 2022, we have this program where particularly in 2023, 2024. So actually I should say that just in terms of this QT program, the quantity for this year is only $4 billion. So it's very minor, but then it starts to really ramp up next year and the year after. So what does that mean? It means that the RBA in effect is going to pull from the market a lot of cheap funding,
Yep.
and then the banks and the governments have to get that funding at a more expensive cost. And that obviously means that in terms of the government, that's going to make fiscal policy harder to manage and potentially could put the AAA credit rating at risk. But also for the banks, if they have a more expensive in terms of capital funding, that means they've got to pass those costs on to consumers. And obviously, like you said before, some banks have already started to lift in terms of their fixed rate products. But obviously, what you and I have discussed off camera is we don't think that some of these new additional funding costs that are coming next year and the year after have been factored in. So in reality, if this program were to be conducted in the manner in which the RBA is now telling the market it's going to be, well, so people last year were borrowing at 1.8, 1.9% in terms of their mortgages. Fixed rates, variable rates. I even, when I went to my local credit union to have a look, some variable rate products around 2.5, 2.6, fixed rates around 4.5. So it could well be, once you start to mix this all together, you could start to see mortgage rates at about 6, 7, 8% variable or fixed, depending on how aggressive that they want to be. And I remember when I took my first mortgage out in 2009, we were paying, I think, 6.75%, because that was the interest rate just shortly after the GFC. And there is no, I have a view that households and the economy cannot take mortgage rates at that level, because even those people who took a mortgage in the last couple of years, the APRA, Australian Prudential and Regulatory Authority, introduced this so-called buffer test. So when people went to get a mortgage, they were assessed by the banks at about 2.5 to 3% above the rate that they were signing the contract for. But if we're now saying that with short-term rates going up and this QT program pushing rates at well above 3%, a lot of these people who were assessed during the pandemic as being able to repay the mortgage, this whole program would suggest that the cost will be well above the buffer. And again, you've got the more accurate assessment as to how many, if we've got, what are we now, 42, 43% mortgage stress?
1.5 million.
1.5 million people. Yep. Well, if this program was to be fully implemented the way the RBA is saying it's going to be implemented, what is the impact on households across the country, Martin?
Getting close to 2 million would be in stress. That's cash flow. It doesn't mean they're all going to fall over tomorrow, but it does mean they're going to struggle, significantly struggle. And of course, the other pressures are still there, the cost of living. And by the way, putting interest rates up is to an extent inflation, isn't it? Because those higher costs have to be borne by businesses, who in turn have to pass those charges on, perhaps through higher costs of their goods sold through the market. So wherever you look, this is bad news.
Yes. Just one point of clarification. So when you said we could go from just over 1 million to 2 million.
1.5 million today is where we are.
Yeah.
So an extra 500,000. That would be based on the sort of the RBA terminal rate that they're talking about, which is what, 2.25%.
So if the cash rate went to 2.25%, another 500,000 households would be in financial trouble.
In round numbers, yeah.
Okay, so if we added the QT program on top, which would push rates even further beyond what the short-term rate would be, do you have an educated guess as to how much more than 2 million households?
I haven't modelled that, but you assume, I think, a relatively linear process, right? So you'd probably be looking at a similar number again, so another 500,000 or something like that. The other point there is some businesses will also get tipped in as well. So you might actually find that it is not linear. Maybe it's slightly more aggressive than that. But I haven't done the modelling on the new projections of rates.
Yes. Now, one thing we know about economics is it's not a hard science like physics. It's a social science. And why is it a social science? Because it involves human beings. And human beings, we know from behavioral economics, they're social animals. And so that's why we have booms and busts, because people tend to do what other people are doing. So, for example, when we talk about manias or FOMOs, it's because everyone's copying everyone else. And that's not a criticism, it's just human nature.
Yep.
So obviously we've had some praise and criticism about cryptocurrencies. And if anyone didn't watch Four Corners last week with the crypto special, I think that was a really good show by Stephen Long. I would recommend people go watch it. But also with property, a lot of people thought times were good, time to get in. And they saw all their friends and family do the same, and they all copied each other. So one of the important aspects of this, Martin, is that when you think about not only expectations, but in terms of confidence. Well, if everyone is struggling financially with raising rates, and people are, I think you said to me off camera, people are not only just nervous, some people are getting scared with how dramatic these interest rate costs will be. Well, that negativity will start to flow through the community, and that will have a feedback loop. A psychological feedback loop will actually impact economic behavior. And one of the things that, in terms of the econometric models that central banks and Treasury use, is they don't model this human aspect of what happens when people feel jubilant and buoyant, and what happens when people feel pessimistic, and what does that actually, because there's a feedback loop, and that really isn't sort of covered in terms of the mathematical model. So I think not only will it be 2 to 2.5 million households in trouble, it will really spread right throughout the community in terms of this negative sentiment of how financially distraught a lot of families are, and obviously. If people can cast their minds back to when we spoke with Eddie Hobbs from Ireland, that feedback negative loop leads to all sorts of social disasters, and those social disasters can happen even if the bubble doesn't collapse, even if people are just really stressed, that could be enough to cause certain people to engage in sort of dangerous behaviour.
So behavioural finance is what we're talking about here, and there is a correlation between what people think and how they feel and what they do with regard to their money. And of course, people will tend to prioritise paying the mortgage almost above everything else. But the question is, what do they give up in the process? Do they eat less? Do they give up on medical treatments, those sorts of things? So what you see is it's not necessarily the mortgage being the only issue, but it's other things too. And by the way, the confidence levels, as reported recently, are as low as they've been, for years. So we're already starting from a low base of confidence amongst consumers. And there's nothing that I can see in any of this information to suggest other than it's going to get worse rather than better from this point.
Yes. Now the other thing is that during this week we had the latest statistics from the ABS in terms of economic growth, and most of the economic growth that was driven. So everyone would have seen the headline numbers: 3.3% year on year, a very buoyant economy, record low unemployment, etc. Well, a lot of that growth was driven by household and government spending. And a lot of that spending, all of that was a lot of it was borrowed money. So again, when we talked about it in our property show a few weeks ago, and I said, as rates start to go up, the first thing that you're going to see is not only confidence, but people's spending habits are going to reduce. That lower spending is going to then have a dramatic drag on economic growth, and basically growth and inflation will come down quite significantly in terms of the short term. Now, the reality of the situation, Martin, is that, and again, so this ultimately comes down to not economics. It comes down to, I was speaking to someone on the phone last night. I said, this is all about power. This is all about politics. And so the reality is that the elite are, in this process of QT and in terms of interest rate rises, they are willing to bankrupt a certain percentage of households, and they don't care if those households go to the wall. But what they will not do is, implode the financial system that destroys their own position. So no government's going to basically, except if I was the PM, no modern government is going to push the economy into a depression and risk losing political power. The RBA is not going to do it because it would destroy the careers of all the entire senior leadership, but also in terms of APRA. The bank CEOs who really run the show in the financial system, they're not going to allow their banks to go bust because of the politicians and the bureaucrats. So these people who control society in this country have a vested interest to keep the show going. And so that's why ultimately at some point they are going to start to voice their opinions both publicly through the press, but also privately in the way this country really works, which is secret conversations in dark corners. And they're going to say, it's time to stop. And we actually started to see some voices saying, hold your horses, don't be too stupid here. And so during the week, we saw an opinion article by an economist called Alex Joyner. And so let's just put this title up there and says, aggressive interest rate rises could trigger housing crash. And basically, what this economist is warning about is if rates go up too soon, too aggressively, that's going to push house prices down. That's going to push a lot of people into negative equity. People are going to start reducing their consumption, and they're going to then use the income to service their mortgage more, so that they could actually get into positive equity, and that will have a huge drag on growth and push the economy into recession. So he's basically saying is, yes, we have an inflation problem, but if you go too aggressive, you could push the economy into recession. And basically threaten financial stability, and the RBA has to balance both. So hold your horses before you do anything too drastic. And obviously, I think that this sentiment is what is going to prevail in the end. And so the question for those who have a mortgage, but also those who want to get into the property market is, things are going to go up. And then they will pause, because if they go beyond that point of no return, then they're going to kill the economy, and then they're going to reverse. So the reason why I've titled this show "The Fake Quantitative Tightening Program" is that I don't think mathematically they're going to implement what they said last week, because the practical reality, and one of the key points that we haven't made is, if anyone reads the May RBA minutes, they are crystal clear. They don't know the impact of these decisions. So they have forecasts, they have modelling, but we've just seen over the last 6 months how bad their forecasting modelling is with respect to inflation. And I don't think they fully comprehend, how credit flows throughout the economy. I think that some of their modelling has been very deficient when they've tried to model some of these relationships, but also they don't have a real feel for how the average Australian person and Australian household is experiencing real economic life. And so because they're in their ivory tower with deficient models, they're going to probably make, they've already made a whole bunch of bad mistakes. And so, people are going to be hurt in the process, but then the question is, someone's going to tell them to stop, and then they're going to reverse. And the question is, when is that point? Now, what I would say is, and again, not financial advice, but I am looking for a potentially larger house myself, because I've got 3 kids. And so when I think about this in terms of my own personal circumstances, I think to myself, well, what I want to do is wait for the interest rate cycle to to the top, because that's when most households will be in the most pain. Prices will be down. There'll be a lot of bargains to be had. And then at that point, it makes sense to enter the property market or to upgrade or downsize, whatever you want to do, and then go into a variable mortgage. And then once they reverse course by cutting rates, well, then your interest costs on your mortgage will go down. So that's if you want to get into property, how to play this market. That's how I think is the best way to play it. So I think it's hold your horses. And while yes, you may take a mortgage with a high interest rate, if they reverse course and cut it over the next say 24 months, your variable interest costs will go down, which means that you can afford your affordability will improve as you go forward, but you've been able to get the property at a good price. But so that's if you want to get in. But if you're already in the market with a big mortgage, there will be a lot of pain over the next period of time, and some people won't survive, and the elite don't care about those people. But if you can survive and you can hold on to your financial position, one would suspect that there would be a relief coming. I mean, even I think you said in your New Zealand show, on your DFA channel, that by the second half of next year, the New Zealand Central Bank are expected to cut. So at some point next year, they're going to reverse course and cut. So as long as you can survive the next 6 to 12 months, you should be in reasonable shape as they reverse course. But obviously, if you can't survive, I think people need to be realistic about what is the best course of action to minimize the pain. So if there is a question of if you're getting tapped on the shoulder by the banks and saying, I think it's time to sell your property because we don't think you can service the mortgage. I mean, there are obviously emotional attachments to property, and obviously feelings of pride and shame about trying to maintain the lifestyle and the status that you've built up. But I mean, one of the worst things in finance and economics is if you're losing to not cut your losses early. And so I think there's a lot of people in those situations where they need to have a realistic conversation and a realistic assessment, and then make the best decision that they can do before they get into too much financial trouble.
Yeah, and there are some data from my surveys that are suggesting more people are actively putting their properties on the market now for that very reason, that they know that their financial system has changed, their financial exposure is too much, and they're looking perhaps to try and escape before it gets any worse. And by the way, the banks are having whispery conversations with quite a few people at the moment along that line. I will just make one other point, John. The Federal Reserve, in their last minutes, also said that because they're starting to do quantitative tightening, their first QT, I think, is going to be about the middle of June, right? But they actually said that they don't know what the consequences of quantitative tightening will be for the financial markets, which means that we're actually running a real-life experiment here.
Yeah, right? We're walking into the abyss.
Yeah, nobody quite knows how this is going to play out, and that's the other point to say. Nobody knows how this is going to play out, right? The stakes are extremely high. There will be people out there who believe definitively they know precisely what's going to happen. But I have the view that it's very, very complex and nobody knows, and that's worth just bearing in mind. So the level of uncertainty is probably higher than I've ever seen.
Yes, and because of that uncertainty, no Australian, whether they watch us or watch anyone else, should basically listen to someone on TV and just say, I'm going to make my decision because so-and-so says so. And even in terms of this show, we have never said to anyone, base your whole economic decision-making based on Adams and North. So we do our own research, we have our own perspective. A lot of the time we agree. Sometimes we have violent disagreements about
has been known
about where things are up to. But again, there's too many people who take statements on TV, in particular, on face value, and there's no critical judgment as to what's this person's track record. And someone like Peter Tulip, and again, let me just come back to this guy. He was the guy that 12 months before the GFC wrote a academic paper about Iceland and said, isn't the Iceland economy fantastic? With 12 months, it basically went into complete collapse. And so once you make those sort of catastrophic judgments as a professional economist, it's time to leave the profession.
Well, let me just go slightly further. A lot of organisations, the HIA, for example, and REA, everyone's got their own in-house economists. The banks have their own in-house economists. Right?
Yes.
People need to understand all of those economists have a story to tell based on where they are.
Yes.
They are, frankly, cash for comment.
Yes.
Right? And that basically means that they are not giving you an objective, independent view. They are giving you a view based on where they are, their position, the organisation that they represent. And therefore, when they say, oh, no, house prices aren't going to fall very much, or, it's all going to be fine, whatever it is, just bear in mind they have an axe to grind.
Yes, only in the last 6 months, Martin, did I hear a particular story of certain people in New South Wales going to I think it was a closed-door lunch with some economists from one of the big four banks, and the conversation in that room was dramatically different to their public statements because they were very blunt. What we're telling you in this room is we can't say it publicly because it would damage the commercial interests of the bank.
Yep.
And so again, that's why I don't think chief economists from banks or market economists from banks should even be interviewed, because it's like, whatever they say has to be heavily qualified because they're not giving you the unvarnished truth. And just for the record, even though I work for a bullion dealer, it's actually, and I'll say this publicly, it's actually in my contract that I can't be instructed what to say. So it was actually one of the things that I did at the very beginning of my commercial relationship, was I said, I'm an independent analyst. I write I look for the evidence. I come up with my own view. I'm not going to be dictated to about what I will say and how I will say it. And if you want to work with me, those are the terms. And obviously, even in terms of this show, we've never instructed each other about what in terms of what to say. So again, I'm not infallible. I can be wrong, but no one is dictating to John Adams must say this, because even in my commercial contractual relationships, I have free autonomy to say whatever I say and however I wish to say it.
And just to be clear, I have no vested interest. I just simply talk about what I see based on my analysis, my models and my philosophy, but I've got nobody staring over my shoulder and making sure that I say X or Y or Z, right? And I actually think that gives you great freedom.
Yes.
But it also gives you great responsibility, because sometimes you will be seeing the things that other people don't want to see, and you'll be highlighting issues that people don't want to talk about.
Yes.
But ultimately, in the long run, I suspect that we're closer to the truth than many of those people who are being paid to make comments.
Indeed. So bringing the show to a close, Martin, is that people need to study the economy and the market very closely, particularly if you have a lot of debt. And I would recommend that people go to the RBA website and read some of these. So there are some academic papers, there are some speeches, there are some, obviously, the minutes and the decisions of the RBA board. Go for yourself and read some of these things and get your head around what they're telling you is going to happen. And obviously you need to have, you need to at least take that on face value. And then obviously critically assess as to, do you think that's going to happen or not happen? And then you need to understand what are the implications for you and your family, and make the best decisions possible for you and your circumstances.
Yeah, and just remind everybody again, the RBA is no more infallible than anybody else.
Yeah, look, to be honest, I would say they're more fallible than in terms of others, because they have been trained in the university system to think in a particular way. And when I got my degree, I got trained in the same way. And then it took me about 10 years to realize that it was all wrong. And I had to basically re-engineer my mind. And once you're brainwashed in the Keynesian school of thought, it's very difficult, and it takes a lot of psychological training to unwind yourself and actually wake up to how the real world works. But that was the journey I took. But too many people in the ivory towers like the RBA haven't been able to go through that philosophical re-education.
No, you're right. And of course, they're not really tested amongst other perspectives. They all hold the same view and they all think the same way. And that's true of most central banks around the world, which is perhaps why we got into the mess in the first place.
Precisely.
John, I appreciate your time today. Very important conversation, and we'll come back and talk some more about this stuff down the track, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Martin North, John Adams, Injuries to the People. We'll see you next time.